Hi, my name is Khalil Cumberbatch, and I'm the Associate Vice President of Policy at the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society, and welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the criminal justice system from various perspectives, including those most impacted by the criminal justice system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that is affected by it. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about both sides of the bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at TheFortuneSOC and at KHA Cumberbatch. Today's show is titled Accomplices, Not Allies: What the Criminal Legal System Reform Movement Needs. The term mass incarceration has become infamous and well known in low-income and communities of color, not only because of the policing practices that accompany the dragnet of arrests, but also because of the under-resourced educational, employment, and public benefit systems, to name a few as well. However, mass incarceration will not end solely because of the efforts of these same communities. Undoubtedly, these efforts need to be led by those communities because those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. Similarly, as the civil rights movement was led by those most impacted, men and women of color, they also benefited from allies of all colors and economic statuses. Similarly, in the era of mass incarceration, the movement to dramatically change the criminal legal system as we know it also needs accomplices. My guest today is Roy Waterman, who serves as the Jewish Council for Public Affairs Criminal Justice Project Manager. His project is focused on educating and empowering the Jewish community to advocate on criminal justice reform at the national and local levels, fostering relationships and building alliances between Jewish and communities of color, policy work to improve law enforcement practices, and developing pilot projects in the field to support communities in crises. Roy is also the co-founder of Drive Change, a vibrant social enterprise nonprofit that uses the mobile vending industry to train, empower, employ, and teach transferable skills to formerly incarcerated young people ages 18 to 25 years old who have been released from adult jails and prisons in the New York City area. Roy, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So tell our listeners, folks who are watching us all over the country, who when they hear criminal justice system or criminal justice reform, their first knee-jerk reaction is not places like the Jewish community. So tell us a little bit about your project and why you took on this responsibility of the project and why in the Jewish community.
Yeah, so it's funny because, you know, I seen it as a very unique opportunity. As you know, we work in the industry of or the field of nonprofit organizations. We're in New York City, which is like the you know, heaven for nonprofit organizations when it comes to reentry. And when I left Drive Change a little over a year ago, you know, I'm a chef as well, and I have a catering business. So I went back to doing catering, but as well as doing a lot of public speaking. And I was being offered opportunities at different organizations, a lot of them we know, and I was just not like, you know, I wasn't feeling, you know, the right synergy. I wasn't feeling like it was the right place for me. It was like a accumulation of a couple different things. So when this opportunity came about, I found it really intriguing because I felt like, wow, a Jewish organization is looking for someone to lead them in criminal justice. So automatically I thought they're looking for a white Jewish person. That's the first thing I thought, right? Like, I thought that automatically. And after, like, you know, speaking to one or two people who knew about the organization, they said, no, absolutely, you should go look into them and see what it is they're talking about. So I went and I sat with the ED and we spoke. And like when I spoke and I told him who I am and what I'm about, it was just like, you know, it was incredible. You know, I felt like, you know, from learning from them as well, because for me it's about learning from the Jewish community about what their core values are, right? Like what do they believe in, what do they stand for, and what a lot of people don't know, because you mentioned in your brief sequology in the beginning about the civil rights movement, is that the Jewish community was heavily involved during the civil rights movement, right? They were right there marching with Dr. Martin Luther King, and were right there being arrested with us, and they weren't directly impacted, right? But they saw that there were injustices that were happening, and they felt the need to be involved because they didn't agree with it. Why? Because they know what it's like to be marginalized when they came to this country. They know what it's like to be segregated against when they came to this country, and they know what it's like to use different restrooms, different restaurants, different everything. So we have a lot more similarities when it comes to communities of color with the Jewish community than a lot of people will ever admit, because traditionally in communities of color, we look at Jewish community as just white people, right? White Americans. And what we don't realize is that they're not white Americans, right? They've been through a lot of dehumanizing, denigrating different treatments of that allow them to feel inadequate, ostracized in many different ways. And as well as I also speak a lot when I engage the communities around the country, the Jewish community, I speak about the Holocaust, right? And it's not something that's easily, I guess you could say easily digestible, because here I am, a black man who is not Jewish, speaking about the Holocaust. But I tell them, listen, I'm gonna speak about slavery, and I'm gonna speak about mass incarceration. So I'm gonna speak about things that don't make me feel comfortable. So I said the Jewish community has to get to the place where they have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. So how I'm gonna talk about what my pitfalls of my ancestors were and what we continue to experience, I'm gonna talk about the Holocaust and the pain associated with the Holocaust, and what restoration was needed, what redemption was needed, what healing what was needed for them to move past the Holocaust, besides them also being receiving reparations, right? And I talk about that, and I talk about slavery, and how slavery is just a manifestation, mass incarceration is a manifestation of what slavery is, right? So I draw those parallels not to compare the two, but to show you that we have all been impacted or affected one way or another, and we've all experienced pain and trauma, and we realize that hurt people, and we need healing, restoration, and dignity to move past a lot of different things. But it's hard to heal from something that continues to impact you every day, right? So slavery never ended. It just morphed into a new beast, right? So we're continuing to see this around the country when we have over 2 million people who are impacted, 70 million Americans that are walking around, 1 out of every 3 blacks, 1 out of every 6 Latinos that are impacted by our justice system, and it's inexcusable. So the Jewish community being involved with this here now today is the re-engagement with the modern day civil rights movement, which is to end mass incarceration.
And what has been what has been the Jewish community's general reaction when they do see a black man talking to them about the Holocaust, but also educating them about what they could do as a community, as I said in the intro, on the federal and local levels?
Yeah, so surprisingly, so when I took the role, I expected pushback from the Jewish community as well as communities of color, right?
Because you would have been essentially in the middle, right? You were somebody who would be entering into Jewish
and I'm
community.
a person that's directly impacted, right? I did almost 13 years in prison, so now I'm speaking from a perspective of a person who is impacted, and I always believe and I always say that there should be no conversations about any sort of type of reform without having people who are directly impacted leading those conversations. And I would go even further than that, because I'm big on language, and say that how do you even reform something that's working perfectly fine? Right? We like to use these terms loosely, that the system is broken, when the system is actually working perfectly fine. What we have to do is break the system that's created, which is built off of institutional racism, and now reimagine what it looks like to be incarcerated in America. We live in a society where it's about crime and punishment, when we need to live in a society where it's about personal accountability and restoration. And those two things don't exist in our current justice system, right? It's really about, you do something, you get locked up, you do 5-10 years, you get released, and figure it out, right? And as we know, within the first 3 years, which is the hot belly time for people to be re-intercepted by the system, most men and women don't make it past that 3-year threshold because they're on parole. And a lot of people, what they don't realize is that most people who are rearrested are not rearrested because they're committing new crimes. They're rearrested because they're on parole and they have a violation because they might have drove a car without telling their parole officer. They might have had police contact. They might have had direct contact with somebody else who had a record. They might have, like, it's an array of different things that are not crimes, they are violations. And people are being sent back to prison doing 2 and 3 year stints and 4-year stints or even longer because they violated something which was ultimately created for you to violate it in essence anyway, right? So, so like for me, it's personal, you know, and I've been like astonished by, I've been well received by the community. I've been embraced. We did our conference in April here at the Sheraton Hotel.
And when you say community, you mean the Jewish community?
The Jewish community. And I don't know, 2 months ago, I spoke at the Anti-Defamation League conference in front of 800 people for 10 minutes about criminal justice reform. So I've been received by the community. Now they want me to come speak in a lot of different places around the country. And it's been like kind of like a whirlwind in a way, but in essence, I'm still like building out this program and this project where I'm like right now trying to establish bail projects in 5 different cities and getting strictly the Jewish community involved to now partner with communities of color. Because like I always say, we don't want to create things without having people of color or people who are directly impacted at the table leading those conversations.
And how has those local communities, because I think when people think of the Jewish community, they think of a tight-knit community, closed-door community,
Yes.
Very secretive in some respects. And so I'm curious to know, how does the advice and the instruction that you're giving, saying that you as a community in some respect have to be a part of a larger community, which is around criminal justice reform and which is around bail reform.
That's right.
How has that been received?
It's been received surprisingly well because I go to core values, right? Like when I talk about the core values of Judaism and we talk about what those are, right? Like caring about and loving your neighbor and like caring about humanity and like all those different things, then how can you lay back and see the injustices that are happening on a daily basis, whether it be due to police brutality, police terror, or mass incarceration, or friendly disenfranchisement, or discrimination on any level. We're seeing it every day. Unfortunately, we know, and I think that when you're educated, now when I talk about educated, I'm not talking about formal education or higher education. I'm talking about just being educated on what's going on in the world. You realize that the media vilifies people of color when they break the law, right? And it's done that for a very long time. And we have to understand that that's not done by accident, that's done by design. So now when you know that, then you can cipher through what is being told to you by looking at things on TV and say to yourself like, wow, what is actually leading to this? And then you go even deeper, what leads to mass incarceration? Poverty. Wow. Also, what's part of poverty? Healthy, sustainable food options. So not only do we have people who are poor committing crimes because they have no access to opportunity, livable wage jobs, housing, stable housing, but also, how about the fact that in their neighborhoods is nothing but processed food or fried food. So now what happens is we are also leading in diabetes, high cholesterol, high blood pressure. So it's all this whole system. When you roll it up into a ball, you realize that you can't just address like mass incarceration without addressing poverty, without addressing healthy, sustainable food. So there's so many different aspects, as I like to say, to these different levels of beasts that we all can play. And I always tell people that there's no one organization or no one person that can fix this entire system. We all have to play our collective respective parts and just like do the work we can.
Yeah, and so I want to definitely come back to the food justice aspect of your work and your critique, that lends to your analysis. But before we get there, I want to ask you a question about, so, you're working in the Jewish community, and through your work and your engagement with them, I'm wondering, one, if there are any messaging tools, like you mentioned core values, and I think you should extrapolate a little bit more about that for our listeners. But I wonder if there are any values that overlap that you can specifically offer to some of our viewers and listeners who may want to engage other communities that are just like the Jewish community? And then secondly, are there any particular communities that you feel we as a reform movement are not engaging well enough?
Oh, absolutely. So when it comes to the core values, my organization is a faith-based organization. So I'm in the faith-based aspect of the nonprofit world, right? But it's still criminal justice, right? So we are dealing with core values of religion. So when you look at the various different religions that exist, they all have similar values, right? Like love your family, be good to your spouse, love your neighbor, take care of your family, all those things, believe in God, serve God, all those things are based off the same principles. You might call them different. We might have different names for these different higher powers, but the principles are all similar, right, in nature. So now when we realize that, wow, you know what? The different aspects of religion, I believe personally, are more created to keep segregation than to keep unity. The more you are more segregated, the easier it is to control you when you're in different patches. But now if you're thinking on one accord, it's harder for me as a government to control you as people who are advocating for rights of other people, right? So whenever we can show that unified effort, whether it's a unified interfaith group or other organizations, Black, brown, white, Asian, whatever the demographic of the people are, whenever we show a unified front, we are always stronger in numbers all the time. So to speak as far as where we focus should be at when it comes to advocacy, when it comes to reform, you can't have these conversations without mentioning Chicago, right? 2 weeks ago, we had 70 people shot. We have 14 people killed. And we have to ask ourselves at the end of the day, and I had this conversation with several different people, because it's unfortunate, it's disheartening when I have conversation and dialogue with people and they point to these young people or this or that, and they do the finger pointing thing where it's the big I and the little U's, right? And it's not really addressing the issue of saying why are they doing this? How did they grow up, right? When you're incarcerated, when you get arrested for a crime, before you get sentenced, they have something called a pre-sentence report, right? And you have a probation officer who comes and he asks you a whole bunch of questions like, where was your upbringing? How, do you grow up in a two-parent household? Where did you grow up? All those things are not the questions we ask to the kids in Chicago, right? And we need to be asking these questions, and we need to find out what is going on there as far as a systemic problem that's allowing so many guns to go into this community, because where the gun's coming from, first of all, and we have to ask ourselves that, and we have to say how many people of color are bringing in shipments of guns or even shipments of drugs. So we have to address those issues, but more importantly, and I always say this, and a lot of people don't agree with me when I say this, but I stand pat by what I believe, and that's this. I felt we know where the current administration stands at, and I don't expect much from the current administration. But when President Obama was in office, I felt like he did Chicago a tremendous disservice, especially being that he was the center of that state. I felt like he did not focus enough effort, enough resources, and enough manpower into really pouring into the Chicago infrastructure to help prevent what is happening now, right? Even when he was in office, every weekend 30, 40 people was getting shot, right? It wasn't getting reported as widespread. It might be getting a little more widespread reported now because we have this person occupying the White House and a lot of people don't like him, so it's easy to report this stuff now. But something needs to be done, and unfortunately it's we have people who are violence interrupters that are being killed out there. We have people who are advocates and who are leading the fight to bring forth peace that are getting murdered out there. So you have to ask yourself, what can be done? I don't have the answer. For me personally, though, I believe a lot of resources have to be poured into the community. A lot of educational programs, vocational training programs is a good start, I think. I believe that basic educational training in any level is a start. Substance abuse training, mental health, needs to be factored in somewhere into there. We need to stop incarcerating people when they're mentally ill and put them where they need to be at. We need to stop incarcerating people who have substance abuse problems and put them in substance abuse treatment centers. So when we start compartmentalizing where people need to be at, we'll be fine, I think.
And so talk to us now a little bit more about food justice.
Yes.
So first of all, what is that, right? Because I think there are people who will hear that and say, what does that mean?
Yeah.
You know, and I would love for you to talk a little bit more about how your realization of the need for food justice led you to found Drive Change.
Yeah.
And you know, why train formerly incarcerated people in culinary?
Yeah.
Right?
So food justice for me is simple. It's, you know, it's not just looking at the finished product of food once it's cooked. It's understanding where the animals, where they grew up at, where they were born at, how they were fed, how they were raised. Like all those things factor into food justice, because what we don't see a lot of times when we go to a restaurant or our plate is served with food on it is the treatment of the animals, right? And unfortunately, there's some films that you can see. One is called Food Inc., which is a powerful documentary that
Netflix.
talks about like the treatment of pigs, right? And how like they raise them and chickens in the dark and stuff like that where they can't see. So when you start looking at these things and you're realizing like, wow, like I still got to start paying attention to what I put in my body. Why? Because in these same neighborhoods we're talking about that has the highest incarceration rate, not because they do more crime, but because they are like isolated and they are ostracized and they are over policed. Those same communities lack healthy, sustainable food options because we have processed meats that we get from our corner stores. We have nothing but fried foods that we get from Crown Fried Chickens and all these other places in our Chinese restaurants in our neighborhoods. And we have to ask ourselves, like, how is that directly leading to high blood pressure, high diabetes, high cholesterol, cancer on multiple different levels of cancer that are happening in our communities? All these things, I always tie everything into the food we consume. A lot of people don't look at things like that. I believe that a lot of diseases we get are from the animals we are consuming. So when we know that, then we start taking a step back from consuming a lot of different meats, or we pay more attention to what we're consuming. Just because something says it's organic doesn't mean a lot anymore either. So a lot of people think when they're consuming organic stuff, it automatically means it's 100% great. I found out years ago from like co-founding Drive Change, from talking to farmers, that when they first came out with the or what organic meant, it was a checklist of like 50, 60, 70 things that you had a checklist to say before you put that organic label on your packaging. Now it's been condensed to about 6 or 7, less than 10 things. So that tells you that there's always a way to cut a corner, to like pull wool over people's eyes and make them think they're eating healthier when, and actually they're not. So ultimately, why food led to being a part of Drive Change is because food was therapeutic for me throughout my almost 13-year sentence. And I realized that food had the uncanny ability of bringing family, friends, and even enemies together. So now in finding Drive Change, I realized that the one industry that wouldn't discriminate against young people was the food industry. Once you had the hard skill set, you could be hired by anywhere. Like that's all it took was like a willingness to learn, a willingness to not say that you know it all, and a willingness to like be a self-starter and work in a team environment. And the sky's the limit. So you can be the formerly incarcerated person that worked as the person that's pushing the broom or the dishwasher today, and 5 years later you can be the executive chef of owning that restaurant. So this is why the food industry, to me, has been one of the most, you know, one of the best industries. And of course, we live in New York where, you know, there are unlimited restaurants. Every day one opens, every day one closes. So the opportunity is always there to work in the food industry. It really is just about skill set more than anything.
So in the last few minutes that we have, I would love for you to articulate to us, what is your vision for this movement around, you know, dramatically changing the criminal legal system? And what can our viewers, who in some respects will be in isolated communities just like the Jewish community, What could they do to get engaged, to become educated, and to start talking about these issues?
Okay, so first I would say from a policy perspective, because my organization is a policy organization, and we are, we do a policy, we write resolutions, and we are in support of sentencing reform, SERTA, which is the Sentencing Correction and Reform Act.
And that's a federal bill?
And that's, yes, so it was a bill that was proposed during President Obama's last term, and it was on the verge of passing. And the reason why it didn't pass is because a lot of Democrats thought they can get a better deal when Hillary Clinton got into office. Unfortunately, we know that Hillary Clinton never got into office. So now we're in a place where we have another bill that's being proposed called the First Step Act. And that bill is basically around prison reform. So it's about improving the conditions around prison. However, it's not addressing sentencing. And I always tell people the fundamental core issue of any sort of prison term is how much time you get sentenced to. So it doesn't matter in the back end if I address a year being 8 months or 6 months, but if I sentence you to 50 years, 50 years is 50 years. We want to address the issue of sentencing with judges' power and discretion. District attorneys have entirely too much power. So we need to address the issue of sentencing so that we can say okay, we can address the issue of sentencing and address mandatory minimums that need to be retroactive. So people who've been sitting up in prison for a long period of time, it would automatically, once it's passed, it would automatically get backdated. So a lot of them will be up for release immediately. So that's that's when it comes from a policy perspective. As far as what people can do is vote. Vote for your local elected officials, your city council, your assemblymen. Those are the gatekeepers to a lot of different reforms that are happening. A lot of people take it for granted. They only want to vote for mayors, governors, and presidents, but you need to vote for your school board district, your school board president, your PTA. All those different positions need to be voted on, and you need to find out what are people's interests. So just don't vote. Find out what their interests are before you decide to vote. And like I said, the Jewish Council of Public Affairs, we're doing work on a national scale.
And what's the website? And
our website is jcpa.org, or the Jewish Council for Public Affairs.org. We are a nonprofit 501c3. We're doing fundraising. I'm fundraising all the time.
Well, Roy, thank you for joining us. Thank you to the viewers for tuning in. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in The Fortune Society. This is Khalil Cumberbatch, and I appreciate you joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars.